I'm Matias. I'm 9. I love my home. We live in Botanilla, in Colombia. I have lots of friends here. Nature is everywhere. My brother's kinda annoying, and my sister's funny. But Milo, our dog, is just the best. We do everything together. We have lots of space to run around and explore. There's so much to see and do here. I never get bored by the outdoors. I also love taking pictures. There are so many cool birds in our garden. Each one is special. It's so exciting when we spot a new one. When I'm not busy watching birds or taking pictures of plants, I love practicing basketball. One day, I want to play for the All-Stars, so I practice a lot. I spend my time going to school, flying birds, playing with Milo, and there's no way I ever get bored. There's always some things fun to do, but I'm worried it's not gonna last. They cut down all the trees. The hummingbirds don't visit as much anymore. Some of my favorite places where Milo and I used to go on adventures, they're not the same anymore. Warehouses and factories are taking over. The air smells bad sometimes. It makes me afraid that my family and I could get sick. And I worry if this is how the future will be when I am older. My teacher said that when I am 35, there will be 3 times more people getting flooded in Colombia. And there will be 6 times more days when it's too hot to play outside. It's going to be tough for everyone in Colombia. Over half of the country will be affected. I see it's already happening here in Botanilla, my home. We have to do something before it's too late. If we don't, will there be any trees? Will the birds return? Will I still recognize my home? But I wonder, what if we get it right? What if we can protect the things we love, our land, our homes? By achieving these goals, Botanilla can stay a happy place, where my family can live and the birds still come to visit. What if my country, Colombia, tries to do the right thing? I heard our leaders are trying and the UN is helping. Colombia is making sure that by 2030 we'll get all our energy for the sun and wind, and something called green hydrogen, which is this cool energy made for the water that doesn't mess up our air, so we can all breathe better and stay healthy. They are also taking care of our forests, which cover half of our country, and our plants and animals, which make up 10% of all living things on Earth. I heard the UN is helping my people grow flowers like anthuriums, teaching them how to protect nature, living better, and send kids like me to school. With steps like this, the flowers and birds will still be here when I grow up. Maybe my home can show the rest of the world how to do it, how to live in harmony with nature. I'd like to be a part of that when I get older, leaving a legacy where future generations can thrive and dream just like I did. It's not too late. If leaders act today, Botanilla in the future might be even better than it is today. What new birds might we see by then? It's not too late. If we act now, I'm excited for the future we could make together. Count me in!
Hello and welcome everyone to the 4th Spotlight session of our Engine Room series this year, looking at working on ambition to action. My name is Nandini Harihar and I'm a Next Generation India Fellow focusing on the future of our oceans and a member of the Engine Room Pact Partnership Action Group. I'm thrilled to be your host for this exciting session. As you join, please introduce yourself in the chat box and please let us know which country you're joining in from. Now let's take a moment to reflect on the incredible story we just heard about Matthias. Imagine being 9 years old again. For most of us, our biggest worry was sneaking an extra slice of dessert, having an extra hour to play outside, or watching more TV. But for Matthias, at just 9 years old, his mind is on the future of his country, his home, and even our world. I don't know about you, but when I was 9, I wasn't thinking about marine and ocean solutions. I don't think they were on my radar then. But Matthias's story is a powerful reminder that sometimes the bravest thing we can do is to dare to imagine a better future. What if together we can actually get it right? This is the spirit of hope and cooperation for a better future that brought world leaders together in New York last month for the UN Summit of the Future, where world leaders set aside their conflicting differences and chose to focus on cooperation for the world, for all of us, by adopting the Pact of the Future and its two annexes, the Declaration of Future Generations and the Global Digital Compact. So what is this Pact of the Future? In short, also known as the Pact, is an ambitious vision with 56 action items focusing across 5 themes to reform global cooperation and rebuild trust in multilateralism. Most importantly, it puts young people, both current and future generations, right at the heart of it, ensuring our security, our sustainability, and sustenance of young people as central and key parts to shaping the future we envision. Over the next 50 minutes, we'll be kicking off our Decode series, an initiative designed to make UN policy accessible to everyone. Paraphrasing Prachi, the Next Generation India Lead Fellow, the UN and its information often feels and seems like a unicorn. Heard of, not seen, not understood, and unknown. So we need to make it and turn it into a common horse, accessible, relatable, reliable, and most importantly, understandable. After that, we'll be moving on to the next segment on intergenerational fireside chat, featuring inspiring young leaders, global experts, and friends from our very own engine room, where we'll reflect on the Summit of the Future and the implications of the Pact of the Future. Moving forward, a key part of our discussion today will be focusing on the learning agenda, titled The Future We Build, a document that emerged from the inputs of young people from across the world. Think of it like a global consultation session that took place over several months with young people, old people, experts, world leaders, working together with the conviction and courage that every voice matters, and together, all generations across can work together to raise and meet the challenges of our time. That's how the learning agenda came to life. It's built around the 5 Ps of people, planet, prosperity, partnership, peace, and explores key questions about future investments in terms of skill, capacity building, technology, or financial and non-financial resources, and the ways to harness the potential of young people and young countries to address global changes, especially those that trickle down into challenges at a national level. The questions will fuel the 2100 Visionary Task Force, a unique intergenerational group of experts and leaders who will be key in designing a long-term post-2030 framework to revitalize global cooperation for the future and to look ahead of what else is there after the SDGs. So far, we've heard about multiple terms. We've heard about the Pact of the Future, and we've heard about the learning agenda. So let's bring this together. Think of the learning agenda as a map, and the Pact of the Future as a compass. The learning agenda shows us the terrain, it shows us the path, it shows us the challenges ahead, and helps us chart our course towards a better future for future generations. The Pact provides us with the guiding principles and 56 action items that we can leverage to ensure that we stay on track. Together, they form a powerful duo to guide us on this grand adventure towards a secure and sustainable planet. Just as maps have been defined and developed over time, the learning agenda is a dynamic document, capturing new insights and adapting to its questions to emerging challenges. Later in this session, we'll hand over the mic to you for an interactive Q&A. However, before that, I'm also thrilled to introduce to you the first segment of the day, the launch of our Decode series. To help kick us off, I'm honored to introduce Dr. Njiri Wagiru. She leads the African Futures portfolio at South Africa Institute and brings extensive experience in future research, international relations, and development. She's also a key part in the UN Summit of the Future and played an important role in shaping the conversations around the Declaration of Future Generations. Dr. Njiri Wagiru, we are very happy to have you over here.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. So you've been at the forefront of the UN Summit of the Future, and I'm sure it's been a very long process. It's been in the talks for the last couple of years, especially over the last maybe 6 months where momentum really built up. Not just participating, but you were actively shaping the Declaration of Future Generations. Could you share why this declaration is so important? How can we leverage the commitments that are contained in this pact and the declaration to continue advocacy? And to ensure that, how do we ensure that the rights of even those that are not born can be maintained? And how do we ensure that this particular document doesn't become another piece on the wall?
Thank you. Let me start with the latter part of your question there. How do we ensure that this documentation shifts from ideas, from words to action, which is the core theme of this discussion today? And there has been, since the Pact of the Future was adopted at the recent UN Summit of the Future, quite a few reviews, analysis, commentaries, and opinions around the utility of the pact to actually make a difference, and some cynicism and skepticism that it's probably just another document that will add to the numerous documents we already have to guide global governance and international agendas without having much traction. And I want to recognize this cynicism and respond to this as well. I think some of the key gains from the Summit of the Future, as well as the adoption of the Pact by the majority of the UN member states, are first and foremost that it demonstrates commitment, especially at a time that is so geopolitically, globally challenging. To mention just a few conflicts and crises in the Middle East, Russia, Ukraine. Here on the continent in Africa, we have quite a few unstable environments and humanitarian crises as well. So in this very turbulent and difficult context, it's worthwhile to celebrate that world leaders and UN member states were able to convene and agree on the Pact for the Future. And it's a document that lays out the next agenda of multilateralism and sets the groundwork for international cooperation and collaboration. So it shows that we do have, to some extent, some agency to exercise as key actors, as leadership on our planet and as a global family. And our intentions are to improve the world that we all share. All challenges and obstacles notwithstanding, I do think it's important that we celebrate that as a key gain. Then another important advantage of the Pact is that it offers us an avenue and a platform to continue advocacy work. We have the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals that are coming up until 2030, but the Pact is for a much longer agenda, including future generations and even the unborn. And it offers us a platform and avenue to continue our advocacy and work in our various sector areas where we're hoping to make contributions. But also it pushes towards collaboration and cooperation on shared interests. So it's a useful document. It's a helpful platform to ensure that we continue our advocacy and build our partnership so that we can leverage on our strengths in our different contexts and in our different geographies and territories where we operate.
Thank you very much for firstly actually recognizing the cynicism. I think that's key. And I think that actually sort of is a breath of fresh air, not to be lying. That is definitely a breath of fresh air. But I also wanted to sort of pick a little bit on the Summit of the Future highlighted the need for meaningful youth involvement. And of course, how do we represent now future generations? What foresight and future thinking can help us navigate these tricky waters? How do we humanize those that are unborn? How do we humanize the rights of people that are yet to be, that we don't even know who are going to be there? So can you elaborate a little bit on what that long-term collaboration, cooperation for this would look like?
Yes, that's a very important question and a difficult conceptual issue as well, because how do we represent the voices and the interest of the unborn? It's a huge uncertainty in terms of thinking around our futures. Are there any actors today that can represent this as yet unconfigured population segment? And from a foresight, from a futures thinking, a foresight and anticipatory governance perspective, it is possible through particular methodologies and approaches. What the Declaration on Future Generations is calling for is a responsibility for each generation to understand our accountability to the generations we are alive with, as well as the generations that we'll be handing over our world and our systems to. And that is already an idea that I think is suitably easy to conceptualize. Then the question is, how do we link it to institutional processes and mechanisms? Again, from a foresight and anticipatory governance lens, there are methodologies that ensure that the decision-making, our policy and strategy processes linked to this decision-making, and the initiatives we prioritize for implementation are based on long-term considerations of what the impacts of these interventions could be, who these impacts will affect in different kinds of ways, and how best, therefore, to situate the priorities and the implementation actions. So what I'm saying is, it is difficult to conceptualize future generations. We would rather focus on our responsibility to ensure we are handing over to the next generations a healthy planet, equitable and just economies, a peaceful society. And there are methods, for instance, in foresight, in futures thinking and anticipatory governance that can ensure our decision-making processes, the policies and strategies that we prioritize to implement, have embedded long-term thinking into how they are designed. That means we care about the long-term impacts of our actions today. And we want to ensure that those impacts, the long-term impacts, are mostly beneficial. So we have already encapsulated the interests of the unborn just by ensuring that the futures we're building, which we may not get to live to see, but the futures we will leave behind as our legacy, as our heritage, and as inheritance for the next, are to the best extent that we could shape them, the best futures that we could hand over.
Thank you very much. I think that was actually a very concrete roadmap and pathway that you listed out for us. And particularly the statement where you said on responsibility and accountability by each generation is very important. It reminds me of this, again, I'm paraphrasing, a saying which is in Uzbekistan, which is that you have every generation, I think it was 7 generations or something, must leave the land exactly as how they found it. And I think that was I'm terribly paraphrasing it, but it was a very powerful statement that I had heard, and you are echoing exactly that. So I'm very happy to. So just last question, we're going to take maybe 1.5 minutes, 2 minutes. But now that you've given us these concrete next steps, and given your think tank's role in the upcoming G20 presidency in South Africa, what moments do you think in 2025 would be particularly important in supporting this advocacy and the implementation of the declaration?
Yes, it's very important that we understand the Pact for the Future, including the Declaration of Future Generations and the Digital Compact, are simply one step in a very long journey that we need to undertake. So the work now calls for us to ensure these commitments, these intentions and aspirations that our global leaders have put their signatures to can be actioned and actualized. And first and foremost, it's very important we build on the idea of collaboration and partnership. So let's ensure that we're leveraging off different networks of shared interest, but also able to share resources so that our work can be better supported through collaboration. Then I think it's important that we ensure we're tracking events, discussions, and conversations across different sectors. The Pact for the Future and its different components are quite wide-reaching. So there are various intervention points, from digitalization and technology to security and peace, education, social development, and there are many conversations, many conferences and events that are gathered around the world, and it's important that we track these to ensure that we are continuously pushing forward the agenda of realizing the Pact. So some of these in 2025, most specifically, that I could mention, and I just went to, this is information that is easily available if you just do a quick search online and get a sense of what the conferences and events are for 2025, and think around what the interventions could be for particular actors or stakeholders groups in particular thematic areas, or even just from a generic general standpoint. But we have the World Social Summit coming up. We have continual meeting with the high-level political forum within the UN. 2024 itself is quite a significant election year, so it's worthwhile to track how new governments will prioritize different strategies going into 2025. We'll get a better sense of what the new regimes in many countries will be looking like in 2025. Important to track that. We also have, of course, the UN General Assembly that happens every year, and the global digital general assemblies that will be planned towards 2027, 2028. So it's also important to think around what are the forthcoming activities and how can we use next year to prepare ourselves and to ensure that we are building on collaborations and partnerships for maximum advocacy in these different forums.
Dr. Wagiru, thank you very much for helping us understand these crucial moments, helping us giving us actually the tools just now within this conversation on how do we track, how do we look at these clear pathways, how do we connect across global moments. So thank you for launching our Decode series. You'll find the link to the Decode series in the chat, and I would encourage everyone to explore these accessible summaries such that you can also be part of these conversations and discussions. Now I'm pleased to hand over to our wonderful moderator, Claudette, a UN Foundation Next Generation Fellow, who will lead our intergenerational fireside chat to further explore these themes in our panel with our panelists.
Thank you so much, Nandini and Dr. Ligeri, for that insightful introduction and for setting the stage for our discussion today. It is an honor to be moderating this distinguished panel. And to kick us off with the introductions, I'm delighted to introduce Julie Garfield-Goffett. Julie is a Senior Director for Sustainable Development Initiatives at the United Nations Foundation. She brings extensive research in advancing the Sustainable Development Goals, promoting human rights, and amplifying civil society's role within the UN. And prior to this, Julie served as the head of human rights and social sustainability at the UN Compact and as a senior human rights policy advisor with the permanent mission of Denmark to the UN. We also have with us an amazing young leader and a member of the Engine Room. Our very own Linda is an active member of the World Association of Girl Guides and Girl Scouts and serves as their youth representative for the Unlock the Future Coalition. Her passion for advocacy and community empowerment has led to champion causes such as gender equality and climate change on global platforms. The third speaker is Khulud Ben Mansour. Ms. Ben Mansour serves as an African Youth Ambassador for Peace at the African Union Commission and is a member of the AU Panel of the Future, a group of young Africans advocating for policies and strategies to harness youth potential in reshaping global governance. With her background in conflict resolution, she brings unique insights on the intersection of peace, security, climate change, and gender development to our discussion. And last but not least, we have Gustavo Westman. Mr. Westman currently serves as a special advisor for international affairs at the General Secretariat of the Presidency of Brazil. With a background in diplomacy and academia, he has held key positions in Brazilian embassies in Italy, Indonesia, and India, focusing on economic and commercial sectors. To kick us off with our discussion, I'd like to turn to Julie. Julie, it's great to have you here. And given that the Pact of the Future makes some bold commitments about closing the SDG financing gap in developing countries, I'm curious to know what strikes you as the most significant about these financing commitments and how they are different from what we have been hearing today. And also, which ones do you think have the greatest appetite to act on among the development donors?
Thank you so much, Claudette, and thank you for having me on the panel. It's a great pleasure to be in the Engine Room. I'm such a fangirl of everything that happens in the Engine Room, so I'm delighted to be here today. I'll try to be as concrete as possible in terms of what the particular actions to look for are, but I wanted to just start off where Dr. Njeri left off, and I think it is an important point about how you frame the narrative around what the Pact is. And I think there's, with so many other documents that you see adopted at the UN, there are two different schools right now on how to view the Pact. And so you can either see it as this reiteration of a collection of words and hopes and aspirations that we've already put forth in numerous times before, with just little adjustments here or there. Or you can, and this is where I agree with Dr. Njiri, you can see it as a really sincere attempt at addressing the current and quite complex situation that the UN is in, that the UN member states are in, that individual people are in, by providing this joint analysis of our global system's shortcomings, of what such shortcomings might mean if they're left unaddressed, and of what reform efforts we should be undertaking in the coming months and years. And Dr. Njiri said this is just one step on a long journey, and I think that's true in particular for the financing track. And, you know, with so many other things, I think perhaps the most fair assessment of the Pact is that it's a little bit of both. There is a lot of words that we've seen and heard before, but there are also quite interesting bits and pieces across all of the 5 chapters in the 2 annexes that will really set us up for a great path to real deep reform and meaningful, impactful actions. So I'll try, like I said, to point to a few concrete things that I do find interesting, that are improvements or pathways to improvements. And so the chapters that I'll focus on is mainly chapter 1 on sustainable development and financing for development, and chapter 5 on global governance, where you do find the crux of the real reform efforts around financing. So 2 things to point out in chapter 1. The first one is action 4 that addresses the financing gap, which is currently estimated at $4 trillion, I think in the latest Financing for Sustainable Development report, and in some recent estimates that I've seen at even above $5 trillion. But what is interesting to me here is that this acknowledgement of member states that they must close this financing gap, and this is the interesting part, to prevent a lasting sustainable development divide, a widening in inequality within and between countries, and a further erosion of trust in international relations and in the multilateral system. So this to me is the most compelling call to action from member states to take this period ahead incredibly serious and to really deliver on the International Conference for Financing for Development, in particular next year, mid of 2025 in June and July. And I'll get back to that in a minute. The other interesting action for me in chapter 1 is action 6. Which is a particular reminder of what additional and improved finance is for. This is for improving the lives of people. And I think it's essential to keep this at the front of our minds as we go into all of these different tracks on delivering on the Pact. This is to improve the lives of people. I heard last week in the prep for the G20 presidency in South Africa that the economy exists for the people. And I think that's such a central part, and you can see that laid out in Action 6. You have references to universal health coverage, to adequate, safe, and affordable housing, access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy for all, and so forth. This is what we need to focus on. The finance doesn't exist in a vacuum. This is for the people. And so I'll jump to chapter 5 and just point out 3 particular actions there that I think are improvements that are new. And just, I want to highlight that this is, of course, not the Holy Grail. I think that everyone can read through the Pact and find interesting bits and pieces. Also, things that have been said before, quite interesting. But this is some of the new parts that I want to point to. And in chapter 5, it's really the actions from action 47 through 52. That are focusing on the finance particular issues, the reform of the international financial architecture. And so the first issue I want to point to is Action 48, which encourages the IMF and urges the World Bank to improve the voice and representation of developing countries. I don't think that this is necessarily a new ask, but it's a central ask, and it has to do with the redistribution of power and privilege. And I think that was at the core of the endeavors of the Pact, and it will be at the core of what we are hoping to achieve at the F54, as this International Financing Conference is called, next year. It is really to create a more level playing field to address poverty, to address inequality, And the elevation of the voice and representation of developing countries in these two particular organizations is going to be crucial. The second point I want to point to is Action 50, which addresses the emergence of unsustainable debt burdens and vulnerabilities in many developing countries, and the constraints that this imposes on their development progress. And I think just to take a step out of the Pact, there's a couple of different strands that are working on this, which also includes the World Bank and IMF that we just discussed. The annual meetings took place last week in DC, and there was a recognition there that that unsustainable debt burdens are actual crises, not just liquidity issues. And I think that's a significant step. So you'll see these sort of new acknowledgements and improvement in different forums. And this acknowledgement last week, of course, builds on Action 50 in the Pact as well. And so there's a particular reference here in Action 50, which invites the IMF to strengthen and improve the sovereign debt architecture. And this particular ask or call is interesting because it can put in motion a process ahead that is, of course, directed at IMF, but also asks that this process be done in collaboration with the SG, with the World Bank, with the group, with the G20 and major bilateral creditors and debtors. So this is a quite big undertaking, and it's been a central ask from developing countries that the sovereign debt architecture be dealt with. The current framework we have is not sufficient. And I know I'm taking too long, Claudette. I'll do this very quickly. Just Action 50, which is a new sort of target set around SDRs, is to me interesting as well. There's a recognition of the $100 billion worth of rechanneling of the SDRs. And there's a new ask in considering a rechanneling of at least half of countries' special drawing rights. And so this is a new sort of improvement to me, and I'll leave it at that, Claudette. Thank you for your patience.
Claudia, I think we're missing your audio.
Thank you. No problem. We completely understand having 5 minutes each is just too little time to understand all of the wisdom that you're carrying. And thank you so much for this, Julie. It's wonderful and timely to see how financing commitments are one of the most pressing things we need to drive real change. And speaking of transformative leadership in global governance, I'd like to turn to Gustavo. So Gustavo, Brazil is taking on quite a remarkable leadership role in global governance right now. You're steering the G20 presidency. You're also putting forward bold proposals to reform our multilateral system. And you are currently advising these processes. So I'm curious about how you see these pieces fitting together and how do the governance reforms outlined in the Pact for the Future align with Brazil's ambitions for the G20 agenda? And finally, what opportunities do you see for these parallel efforts to really push forward a more inclusive global governance? I know it's very unfair for me to say because I've asked 3 questions, but you have 5 minutes to answer.
Hey, Claudette, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Great pleasure to be here. And thanks for the invitation, Claudette. Well, we started very well. I was following the beginning of our discussions today. Amazing. So really, really good to be part of this group. I'm going to try to be brief. It's a very tough question indeed. I mean, it would deserves longer reflections, but in a nutshell, well, it's needless to say that the current governance model is in crisis, right? So we've been seeing so many problems, and what you can see is that the solutions presented so far are definitely, they prove to be insufficient to the current demands. So what can we do? Well, based on that, Brazil has been figuring out, and by leading extremely important international process, right, including, we started last year with the Amazon Summit, and then Mercosur meetings, and this year G20, you have next year BRICS, COP30. So it's a lot going on, and there's a lot on the table. But we figured out that in order to address these current global challenges, we need to get out of the box, all right? We need to be more ambitious. And we haven't been that ambitious so far. I believe the Pact for the Future was an extremely victory for the humankind. I mean, it's started settling the road ahead or giving the directions to follow. But I think there is a lot to do based upon that. So these kind of discussions we're having here and several others. So how to implement it, how to turn the Pact for the Future into reality, because we really need to start working now. I have been discussing about COP30 a lot in recent days, and guys, I mean, it's now or never. It's really the moment to start acting. With that in mind, and considering the chaos we are living in the international agenda, Brazil has been trying to focus on very pragmatic results and trying to overcome the conflicts we are facing and the polarization we are seeing by finding synergies, right? So that's for those reasons that we, and I believe President Lula was extremely wise in identifying the priorities for the G20. So the fight against hunger, poverty, and inequalities, sustainability, climate change, and just transition, and the reform of global governance. So those are the topics. We may diverge on how to implement them, but no one will question that you need to address these issues regardless of the spot in the world we live. So regarding global governance, reform of global governance, and that I believe was the focus of your question. So what do we need in order to make better decisions? We've been figuring out that we need to hear more voices of the South. We need to hear more voices of new stakeholders. And by that, I mean civil society, private sector, grassroots movements. We need to listen to the people who ultimately will be affected by decisions taken by bureaucrats sitting in their offices. So that's extremely important to listen to them. And of course, we need new mechanisms for finance for development, all right? So without the adequate means of implementation, all we are discussing here, and I beg your pardon for the word, is bullshit, okay? So we need to find concrete ways of turning all that into reality. And by that, we mean finance. We've been discussing that at the United Nations. Secretary General has suggested or created a group of selected countries, and we have this, let's say, initiative called SDG Stimulus, aiming at influencing other countries to accelerate their investments and financing for development. But again, things have been slow, and we need to work more on that. I'm already kind of going to the conclusion, but I'd like to highlight a few other points. So one of the legacies I believe we're going to leave at the G20 is exactly what we are calling social G20. I think we made it very important progresses. So we're discussing the taxation of the super rich, where the task force on climate change has made significant progress. We have the Global Alliance Against Hunger and Poverty, so many nice things. But the social G20 to me is definitely one of the legacies, and hopefully that will be a legacy. I saw our colleague from South Africa here, and I was just in South Africa last week talking to the President's office and Minister of Foreign Affairs to make sure that the South Africans continue with this social G20, because we cannot understand the problems of real people without talking to these people. And that's extremely important to us. We all know that changing is tricky. I mean, getting out of a comfort zone, everything that's innovative and new, it scares us. But I think time has arrived to change our mindsets. In the case of the youth, it's extremely interesting, because something that I've been listening a lot is for very old people saying, once I was young, so I understand the problems of the youth. And that's so out of place, you know, like the challenge that the world has changed so much. And only the youth knows the challenge faced by the youth. And now that we're discussing future generations, Pact for the Future, I mean, we're discussing future projects beyond the 2030 agenda. You guys, the youth, have such a key role in discussing and promoting. But once again, I'm pretty confident that if you don't give voices, if you don't listen to the new voices, we'll be only repeating the same mistakes. That was it. I mean, I tried to be extremely concise and brief. Hope you kind of had an idea. And you have my contact. Claudette can give you guys my contact. So if you need to get deeper into some of these points, feel free to contact me anytime. Thank you very much, guys.
Thank you, Gustavo. And as a Latin American myself, I'm incredibly honored to see how Brazil is taking all of these opportunities and leading as boldly as possible. And now, speaking about building inclusive systems for peace and giving the power back to youth, let's turn to Kuluth. Kuluth, you're an African Youth Ambassador for Peace and a member of the recently launched AU Panel of the Future. Could you tell us in 5 minutes what investments are needed today to reduce violence and build peaceful societies across Africa and the MENA region? And specifically, are there any ideas from the Pact for the Future which can help your efforts to be more inclusive?
Thank you very much, Ines. Thank you for the lovely introduction and for the opportunity to discuss this critical issue. I'm very pleased to join this esteemed member of the panelists. As an African Union Youth Ambassador for Peace and also a member of the AU Panel of the Future, I'm deeply aware of how urgent the need for investments, which will enable us to build peaceful societies across Africa and the MENA region as well, is important. And I believe that peace is foundational for the sustainable development, and it requires a multifaceted approach. So I think one of the most pressing investments that we need today is obviously education, particularly peace education and vocational training as well. According to the World Bank, countries with higher education levels are significantly more resilient to conflict. So when we speak about empowering young people with skills and knowledge, we can reduce also violence and cultivate this culture of peace and tolerance. And I remember also last year when we started working on the theme of the African Union, the theme of the year, which was education, we highlighted how we as youth ambassadors for peace, we recognize how important education is for the continent and for our regions because it cultivates peaceful dialogues amongst each other. For instance, initiatives like the African Union's Youth Skills for Employability program, which aim to provide training that not only enhances employability, but also it fosters social cohesion. This means investing in youth-led initiatives is essential, and I believe it has a rewarding effort and a rewarding result, in the long term, because it's showing us how the future generations, and here we're speaking about the most youthful continent, Africa, is actually important in sustaining peace and security. I remember reading a report by UNDP which highlights that when young people are actively involved in peace building, the likelihood of achieving sustainable peace increases. So there is a direct link between both. And the African Union has seen successful youth initiatives that tackle issues like violent extremism, community conflict, such as the African Youth Peace Ambassadors Network. And here our role actually was to translate the messages and the pressure and issues of young people and also present solutions and recommendations by working directly with the member states to reduce the tensions and the conflict in our regions and in our communities. I think we need to scale up funding also and resources for these initiatives. We must ensure that young people have the means to drive change in their communities. And we have seen live examples about this. We must also prioritize the strengthening of local governance and community structures that promote inclusivity. And I remember during our appointment, there was the Silence in the Guns initiative also, which underscored the importance of empowering marginalized voices in decision-making processes. I believe that the center should, or the focus should not only be around the people who have access to such platforms or to high-level meetings or opportunities where they can discuss and influence or actively participate, but also we should think about the groups that they don't have enough access to digital platforms or to rooms where they can actually share their needs and their concerns. And I believe that having the education or the powerful tools or the right access might actually help them contribute actively to peace and security. I think I'm going to give you an example. There is a data from the UN that shows that when we have young people and young women included in peace processes, the likelihood for peaceful agreements increases by 35%. So when we ensure that young people and marginalized groups are represented, we can actually create more equitable and effective peaceful strategies. So I think from my side, our role here and the role of young people is not only evolving around participating, but also educating each other, learning from each other, and cultivating a culture of peace among each other. And I think here there's an urge for global institutions to facilitate also partnerships which allow African and MENA countries to collaborate, to share best practices, and to pool resources for conflict prevention. This is very important today. If we are speaking about peace and security on the long run, we need active collaboration between both stakeholders. We need to create trust between the policymakers and young people. We must work in collaboration, in strengthened collaboration indeed, between the young people, their ideas, and the expertise of our leaders. So we create a platform of intergenerational dialogues. I think coming from an institution that is of the African Union, which is already a platform for such collaboration, we need commitment from the policymakers. This is what we only missing to invest in these regional initiatives. And I think reflecting on the Pact for the Future, which provides a framework for global institutions to adopt a more inclusive approach to peace building, specifically highlighting the need for policies to prioritize youth engagement and ensure their active participation in shaping peace initiatives. This aligns with our collective goal in fostering peaceful societies. For instance, this emphasis on intergenerational dialogue, it can actually enhance understanding and collaboration between youth and established leaders, which makes our peace efforts more holistic. And this is actually what we are looking for. I think we need to have a solid ground on which both partners or all partners can collaborate together, and also advocate for the right tools and mechanisms or the right channels through which we as young people or as a constituency have an active role to promote peace education and peaceful dialogues. I'll stop here for the sake of time. Yeah, perfect timing. And of course, I'm happy to take more questions as we go by.
Thank you so much. I understand it's no easy, but these powerful insights on bottom-up and nurturing approaches are definitely what we wanted to hear from you. And before I jump into a final question for you all, I just wanted to remind all of those engaging with us that we are coming to a Q&A segment. So please keep your questions coming. And now, speaking of youth leadership and transformative change, I'd like to turn to Linda. Linda, you're a member of the Funders Collective Youth Advisory Board, and you're at the heart of shaping this new funding initiative, which aims to support young people driving global change with a focus on the SDGs. And I wonder if, reflecting on the Summit of the Future and its recently adopted Pact, how can the Funders Collective approach to youth-led design and flexible funding help transform these global commitments on gender equality into concrete action?
All right, hello everyone. Thank you very much for this invitation. It's a privilege to be here with you and to stand with such a passionate group of change makers. So together, let us explore how we can move from ideas to sustained and impactful change, focusing on gender justice. So to me, the Funders Collective's youth-led design and flexible funding has the power to truly bring the world's gender equality promises to life. This isn't just about funding projects, it's about trusting young people to shape a future that stands firm on the pillars of equality, justice, and opportunity for all. Having been at the Geneva convening and the Summit of the Future, I've witnessed firsthand the power of young voices shaping solutions that resonate locally and move us forward globally. When young people, especially young women like myself, are empowered to co-create these solutions, It's not just about reaching outcomes. It's about building a future rooted in ownership, resilience, and meaningful change. Flexible funding doesn't just remove barriers, it fuels innovation. It gives young leaders the power to adapt, respond, and create impact in real time. This adaptability is not just a luxury, it's essential because gender inequality manifests differently across regions and communities. So let us remember that gender equality is not a checkbox, but a bridge. It's a bridge from promise to action, from intention to impact. And through the Funders Collective, we are ensuring that resources flow directly to those who need it most, often the young women and grassroots leaders who bring hope and solutions to life in their communities. If there's one thing I hope we carry forward, is this: our commitment to equality must be as dynamic, as resilient, and as deeply rooted as the youth who lead it. Together, we can make the Sustainable Development Goals a lived reality, not just a global promise. Let's not settle for conversations. We are building the future, and the future starts with action led by youth for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing. You must feel so proud on the work of the Unlock the Future coalition is doing to empower youth and drive progress on the SDGs. And now I'm excited to open the floor to our audience, but we've seen a lot of engagement with the Q&A section, which we are grateful for. And now it's time to continue sharing your thoughts as we move forward. But before that, I'd like to quickly gauge our collective understanding of some key concepts we've discussed today. And in order to do that, we'll run through 3 polls, and please respond as quickly as you can. Our first poll is about the Pact. And let's start with understanding everyone's familiarity with the Pact that was just adopted. Before today, how familiar were you with the UN Pact for the Future? Very familiar, somewhat familiar, not familiar, or create new agencies? Amazing. Great to see that almost a third of us today were already familiar, and a third of us were somewhat familiar. Now it's time for us to turn into which aspect of the pact resonate most with you. So the second question says, which aspect of the pacts matter most to you? Climate action and environmental protection, digital technologies, peace and security, education and job opportunities, gender equality and human rights, all of the above, or simply it's just too difficult to pick one? Thank you for sharing your priorities. And finally, let's discuss what you've heard about the pack and help clarify any misconceptions. So, what have you heard about the pack? Select what matches your understanding. It's a voluntary agreement to improve international cooperation. It focuses on climate action. I've heard it will restrict individual freedoms. I've seen claims it will create a global digital ID system. I'm not sure what it contains, or I've heard conflicting information and I'm uncertain about what to believe. thank you all for participating in these polls, and your responses show there's a lot of interest in understanding what the Pact means for young people, and also some important questions about you have heard about it. Speaking about questions, now let's turn to the ones that you have been submitting in the Q&A. And our first question from the audience is for Julie. This question was submitted from Khalid. Khalid said financing is hard where we can find the major to minor cause of human rights violations within our communities and societies. So how should we think about making financing investments in developments while also advancing human rights?
Thanks so much, Claudette. I think for me, these things are very much connected, and it goes to the point that I made in the first intervention about what the financing is for. It's still for the improvement of the lives of people, right? And so if you don't address at this point in time the debt crisis that we've established it to be, when you have countries in the global south that are spending more than 50% on their GDP on debt servicing, there is, of course, not sufficient finance in country to invest in education, to invest in healthcare, to invest in upskilling, reskilling, all the different things that makes livelihoods better and that uplifts people, that have everyone sort of share a commonality around equality and so forth. And so I think that's why I wanted to point that particular point out at the outset, that this is the link. It does not have to be a big metaphysical conversation about an international financing architecture and SDIs that we don't even understand the real definition of. It is actually very concrete for people on the ground, that you have to ensure that you have the proper investments in these different aspects that I've already mentioned. Of course, governance issues, human rights issues, anti-corruption, illicit financial flows is all part of that particular package. It's not as if you can solve any of the big issues that we're dealing with only with official development assistance, only with renewed resources from the World Bank and IMF. There is a huge emphasis also on domestic resource mobilization and the internal de-risking that has to happen in country for investments to come in from private sectors and others. So these issues, they all go hand in hand. And if you dig deep enough on all of the different strands on the peace and security, on the prevention agenda and sustainability and finance, you come down to the same core principles. And they are related, of course, to human rights, to anti-violence, anti-corruption, governance, and so forth. So for me, it's all very connected. There's one particular point that I want to make, though, and it was interesting that it was not possible to select finance in your overview of what was the most interesting parts of the Pact. And this is what worries me a little bit, because I can promise you that there's not a sense of urgency in the global North governments around F54 for next year, which I see as crucial and necessary for everyone to push past the red lines that we've seen reiterated over the past couple of years. So what's really needed is a particular emphasis, understanding, and excitement even around the financing. You've seen this wave of push and activism around climate, but at the core, like we just discussed, is financing, and there's a huge opportunity ahead. It is actually one of the first opportunities after the agreement of the Pact for us to really deliver on something that can have a massive impact on rebuilding trust in the multilateral system. So there really is a need also for young people to push on this, rally your governments, rally your local communities, in particular in global North capitals, but not only. It really needs to be a big push for us to achieve something new and meaningful 9 months from now. It's a steep hill to climb, but I do believe that we can get there. Thanks, Claudette.
Thank you so much, Julie. And now there's a question for Dr. Nigiri from Ruchira. Could you tell us, if you're still around, could you tell us more about the specific methods and tools for assessing long-term impacts of the decisions which you reference? I know that it's a hard question and we have limited time, but any attempt will be extremely welcome.
Thank you. And just to clarify, the tools I mentioned were more in terms of ensuring robust and resilient decision-making for the long term. If we're going to have a conversation around measuring the impacts, that will be another set of tools. But in terms of foresight and anticipatory governance tools, some that I can mention that are quite popularized already are scenario planning. Scenario planning allows us to think around different decision-making options, plan around what the impacts might be, and embed in our responses particular mitigation measures for risks or optimizing measures for opportunities. Another key tool that we use quite a lot in our work at SAIA, at the South African Institute of International Affairs in South Africa, is the Three Horizons framework. This is a framework that allows us to think around what are the current systems and what is working well within our current systems and models of doing things. What about current systems need to change, and how can we best hospice or allow these system elements to fade away, and how can we let go or detach from these system elements that no longer serve our purposes? What are the required innovations to move us towards the futures we want to achieve? And it also allows us to clearly define what these future environments, what these future worlds look like. So those are just two that I've mentioned, but there's a whole toolkit in terms of foresight and anticipatory governance, specifically around boosting decision-making. And then, of course, it is important to think around measurable indicators. But once we've mapped out the path of where we want to go and how we want to get there, then deciding what the measurable indicators for progress are so that we can monitor, assess, and review our actions is a secondary step. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I couldn't have said it better. And the final question is for Kulut from David. And as a young man in Nigeria, I'm keen to get your suggestions on how to get involved with actions to generate peace, and particularly in a country where youth are limited or regarded as less experienced.
Thank you very much for the question. And I think this is the most asked question that we also get to hear in our frequent encounters with our peers. And it's very important to know that this is also a very good way to showcase their interest in being actively engaged in peacemaking and peace processes. I think one of the best approaches is to identify the active networks in the community or in the region through which they can be involved, through which they can be introduced, and they can showcase their interest and potentially also showcase their expertise and the knowledge that they have built throughout the years. This can be actually very helpful to leverage on what you have already gained in terms of expertise and knowledge, but also bring value to your community and help influence other young people to continually being active in peace dialogues. And the more you are engaged and the more you sustain these efforts, I think it's going to give you more visibility, and it's going to give you more opportunities to showcase your work at regional or continental or even global levels, which is very important because you will be transferring those messages of the people from your country to the international sphere or to the regional sphere. And I believe such opportunities are very, very important because we need representation, and we need also to understand the dynamics that are happening in the world. So being a messenger of peace from your community is important, but you always have to start at the grassroots level. So I think identifying or mapping the active networks within your region is the first step that you need to do, and to understand what you actually can do to identify your role as agent of peace. And of course, I think if anyone needs support in actively being engaged in any of the networks, I think we have representatives from the West African region. They can also reach out to the Youth Ambassador for Peace to West Africa, the AU. We have networks, we have WhatsApp groups, we have opportunities that we can share. So this is also a platform for them to introduce themselves and to engage with us within the Youth for Peace Africa program and also in other opportunities. So I hope this helps in answering the question.
Definitely, Kulu. Thank you so much for landing this into actual next steps. And before I wrap up, I'd like to highlight one of the key takeaways from our rich discussions today. We learned that we must get out of the box and be more ambitious to allow system change. We learned that we can have ownership on the future and the agency to shape it through all of the wonderful parts from the pact, either finance for development or peace, gender equality. And the final thing is that young people are on the front run to change this. So I wanted to express my gratitude to our amazing panelists and our audience for their insights and time. I'm incredibly sorry that we couldn't ask you all a question, but this was such a rich discussion, and we look forward to continuing these dialogues going forward. Finally, speaking of shaping the future, we would love to capture your ideas. So we will be sharing a mirror board in the chat with the question, what's your big idea to help the Pact for the Future happen? Over the coming weeks, please draw or write how you like to get other young people excited about this, because we are looking forward to working beyond this goal to make it happen. Again, thank you so much for today. What's next? Please remember to read the learning agenda and Pact Decoded. These are key elements that help us navigate the road to 2100. Join us to our next big stop on December 9th, with which we'll close the engine room for 2024. And stay tuned on our social media for opportunities to engage with the engine room. Thank you all for being part of this journey, and see you at our next session.